John.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
Couldn't be better.
Shouldn't you be meditating or something?
I did that earlier this morning, and that's why we have this picture of equanimity, on my side of the screen at least.
I'm feeling pretty Buddha-like myself.
Oh, really? What'd you do to earn that
Well,
status?
I should tell you, this is actually a little visual joke I'm playing here. I have a porcelain Buddha in my apartment that I bought in New York about, 20 years ago. Even though I'm not into Buddhism, I like images of Buddha, especially the happy, smiling Buddha. And so I bought this happy, smiling Buddha, and I look at him when I figure I need a little injection of cheer. So I'm people are now seeing not me, but Buddha.
So when you need an injection of cheer and I'm not available to talk to, you turn to the Buddha.
It's just kind of one of these silly, superstitious things I do in spite of pretending to be a rational person.
Yeah, well, maybe we should explain that, the Buddha reference. I mean, this is in some ways an alarmingly open-ended and vaguely defined dialogue we're going to do on kind of meditation, mysticism, Buddhism, altered states of consciousness. I guess we could maybe try to inject some sense of dramatic tension by saying that I think in general you are more of a skeptic of meditation practices and their associated philosophies than I am. So there may be some disagreement along those lines.
Yeah, but I think it's fair to say that I'm a skeptic who's certainly given it a try, and I'm more of a 60s person. I'm a little older than you, so I was exposed to all that 60s interest in mysticism and altered states, all the things that you just mentioned. I had a lot of friends who went running off after crazy gurus, and I'm skeptical, but I remain fascinated by the whole mystical quest.
Yeah, I gotta say, I kind of wonder how... I mean, I don't doubt that you've done more than dabbled in altered states of consciousness, but as for meditation practices per se, I read your piece, Why I Gave Up Zen, to which we will link, and I was left with some question as to whether you ever had it to begin with. I mean, it sounds more like you were kind of almost alienated from the get-go. You went and listened to this Zen teacher, she was annoying, the guy next to you was annoying. You thought about it a while and said, I'm annoyed, and did you really seriously pursue a meditation practice?
Well, the Buddhists who've reacted to my writing certainly don't think so. They are sort of like the Freudians who say you have to undergo 10 years of analysis before you're qualified to say anything about psychoanalysis. And of course the assumption is that if you devote that amount of time, you will become a true believer. I mean, I've been interested in Buddhism since I was a teenager. I've read a lot of mystical texts. I've also practiced yoga. I got into Kundalini yoga and had a pretty serious practice back in the 70s that involved meditation and various contortions and breathing exercises and those sorts of things. So, that Zen piece was just about this one experience with one teacher who was really not a good match for me. But my criticism of Buddhism comes from looking at it pretty much through my whole adult life, and very intensively while I was doing research for my last book, Rational Mysticism.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I am qualified to say that it's a bunch of claptrap.
Although in Rational Mysticism, I like that book a lot. I think I may have even blurbed it. One criticism I made to you privately, I guess, is that in terms of the kind of experiences you describe, in the first person that constitute much of the book, it's mainly, almost entirely, I think, drug experiences, right? I mean, you go to these Native American cultures and stuff. It's not like street drug experiences. It's authentic, indigenous or whatever, but there isn't.
Yeah.
There isn't much description of. I mean, that doesn't seem to be part of your... Just to read that book, I would not have thought, I think, that serious meditation as part of your database?
I have a really ambivalent attitude toward meditation. I've had enough positive experiences with it where I feel as though, right now, I feel as though I've got a couple of Zen cushions in the living room right next to where I am now, and every time I glance at them, I get this little guilty twinge because I think I should be meditating in the morning more as a therapeutic thing than anything else.
Well, maybe yeah, go ahead.
Well, so I'm curious to know, one of the things I wanted to talk about with you, because obviously you've got a very serious practice when you talk about doing, you're doing it pretty much every day or maybe every single day, but you've also gone on these retreats, and I want to know what you're trying to get out of it. And the big question for me when it comes to all these spiritual practices, and that can be psychedelics, yoga, meditation, prayer, all the things that we do to try to cultivate our spiritual nature, is whether the goal is knowledge and insight of some kind, or whether it's therapeutic, whether you're just trying to make yourself happier.
Right.
So I want to put that to you, Bob. What drew you to this in the first place?
Right. Okay, good question. First of all, I should say, I wouldn't say I have a real serious meditation practice. I have twice gone on these meditation retreats, which almost compel you to get seriously immersed into the practice for a week. There's not much else to do. You can't talk. You do sitting meditation for 5.5 hours a day, walking meditation for 5.5 hours a day. You don't have to show up for the stuff, but there's not much else to do. No newspapers, no email. So I did it, and those were both pretty powerful experiences. And I am now, in the wake of the most recent one in August, I am trying to sustain a daily practice. It's very hard, coming out of those. However sure you feel coming out of them that this time it's for real, it's hard to sustain the practice. So I don't purport to be any kind of serious Buddhist, really. But
well, Bob, just for starters, explain.
Yeah.
You had a very, certainly a more profound experience than I ever had on meditation in your first retreat that you described in that post on the New York Times website, I guess, I don't know, 2 months ago. So maybe you could just start by trying to describe that experience for folks out there.
I would say there were two impressive things about that experience. That was my first meditation retreat in 2003. One I'm more interested in talking about than the other, actually. The very powerful experience you're describing, I don't want to describe in great detail, actually, because I may at some point, but it was, the details are kind of personal, having to do with my own psychic demons and stuff. And I'm sure you don't want to hear about those, John.
But that's kind of the point, Bob. So if the question is the degree to which these experiences are therapeutic, then the demons, maybe you can just try to describe it in a way that doesn't disclose too much.
Well, let me say the premise. I think, and it's going to be hard to talk about Buddhism because just like any kind of religion or philosophy, almost certainly any religion, it's become so variegated. There's so many different Buddhisms. You were trying Zen, which in some ways is very much like the tradition I was looking at, which is, an Americanized version of Vipassana, in some ways very different. But anyway, I think one thing we can say is pretty common to Buddhism is the premise that the two things you're asking about, seeing the truth and therapy, have the same resolution, right? The idea is that, in fact, it's Dharma has this two-sided meaning, I think. It's both the truth about the way things are and the path you should follow in light of the way things are. And the idea is that the path leads to liberation or an end to suffering or whatever, right? So the idea in Buddhism is that seeing the truth can if the truth is seen in conjunction with a dedicated practice, it can be therapeutic, right?
Right.
And I guess one way of saying why part of my attraction to this is that historically with me, it has not been the case that seeing the truth makes you happier. Right. It's like, and more specifically, the truth about the human predicament.
Yes.
Because as you know, my book, The Moral Animal, was my version of the human predicament. Mm-hmm. It was in light of Darwinism. My argument was that evolutionary psychology is the truth about the way, why things are the way they are, why the human predicament is what it is. And yet, one thing I noticed was attaining what I thought was a fairly thoroughgoing comprehension of the problem did me no good whatsoever, as a practical matter.
Yeah.
I still think it's the truth, but it's an apprehension of the truth that doesn't do you. I mean, I do think it may help you a little bit in the moral department, if only because it makes you more uncomfortably aware of moral contradictions and deceptions in your own life. I do think evolutionary psychology can have that effect on its own, but that doesn't really make you happy, or may make you less happy.
Right.
And so I like this. I'm interested in the claim that there's a way of thinking about the truth about the way things are that can lead you to more happiness and equanimity, and particularly in light of the fact that I actually think, I spent a few pages on sayings of the Buddha and the moral animal. I actually think he was kind of the first evolutionary psychologist. I mean, I think his view of the human predicament is very consistent with the view I get from evolutionary psychology. So I'm like, well, if you can take that view and make me happy, where do I sign up?
And so, what happened? In your experience, did you get any inkling or glimpse of a kind of truth that would provide some consolation about the human condition? And I guess you have to talk about, for me, the big issue is dealing with mortality and the transitory nature of life, and the fact that everything that you love is doomed. So if you come up with some sort of insight that gives you some sort of happiness, although that seems too trivial a word for what we're talking about, that the insight has to have something to do with mortality, it seems to me.
Well, for you, I think you may have a little more of an emphasis on that particular question than I do. Mm-hmm. I'm actually not very death obsessed at all.
Lucky you.
Yeah, well, I don't know. The prospect thought of in the abstract has never really bothered me. But maybe that's because I only think of it in the abstract. But I will say, I mean, I can get around to that. I'll say that the worldview I kind of sunk into this retreat, I can see how among its benefits would be more equanimity about the prospect of death and assimilating the suffering of loved ones and things like that. Yes, I see that. I wouldn't call it the primary payoff I felt, but I can see that. And gee, I don't know where to start. I mean,
let me ask you a question before. One of the problems with this topic is that there are just so many different ways to approach it and so many different questions that I still have about it. But I'm really curious, because you and I are I hope you're not insulted by my saying this, we're somewhat alike in that we see science, I think, as the primary mode of knowledge. We like to think of ourselves as rational people, and yet we are attracted to some of these spiritual disciplines or ways of knowing reality. What interests me most about Buddhism and the Eastern religions in general, and this again goes back to the 60s, is the idea that there's this ultimate state of knowing or being called enlightenment, which is almost like an escape hatch in reality, where you get out of all the problems of being a mortal creature. You transcend that, and you reach some kind of state of of bliss, or it's knowledge plus consolation fused in some way. You transcend the normal categories of good and evil. All that kind of stuff wrapped in one package. And one of the things that I set out to do in my last book was just to figure out if I really believed in that state myself. And I just wonder if you think that that's possible, if you've gotten a glimpse of it, if that's even a goal of yours.
I think I've just gotten a glimpse of why you were disappointed in Buddhism, if you were hoping for that. I like that, but I think my aspirations are a little smaller scale.
Mm-hmm.
I think,
but of course there are people, I know you've had contact with people who claim that state does exist, and even claim to have achieved it themselves.
Yeah, I will say that at the place I went, the Insight Meditation Society in Barrie, it's not a very pretentious place. Mm-hmm. They are emphatically not trying to turn the teachers into gurus. So I haven't had contact with a lot of people making really extravagant claims. But with respect to what you're saying, It isn't that I honestly expect to achieve some sort of ultimate enlightenment and see things from the mountaintop. It's that I am convinced, and this is partly, again, from this Darwinian perspective, from evolutionary psychology, I'm convinced that the view of things we naturally have by virtue of being human beings is a very constricted view.
Yeah.
And it's morally corrupted. And it's also constricted as far as metaphysical truth goes. So as far as moral and metaphysical truth go, in other words, we know what moral means. As far as metaphysical truth, that is actually apprehending just the actual structure of reality, okay? I'm convinced that in both of those cases, we naturally have this really unsatisfactory, limited, misleading view of things. And I would just like to get a little closer to the truth. As close to the truth as possible. I have no illusions about attaining ultimate enlightenment, but I will say, certainly along the moral dimension, during these retreats, I got appreciably closer to what I think is the truth, a true moral perspective with respect to the other beings on the planet and with respect to yourself and so on. I had said there were kind of two things that happened on the retreat. One was this particular distinct dramatic experience while meditating. And this was like the fourth or fifth night of the retreat. But there was also a slower, ongoing transformation, largely independent of that affected just your kind of almost your every waking moment. Mm-hmm. And that consisted of becoming, first of all, much less judgmental about other people. Mm-hmm. It's like, at the beginning of the retreat, it's like typical Bob, sizing up people on the basis of very little evidence and making fairly dramatic judgments about, And I think more than a lot of us realize, we all go through life like this to some extent. It's like, just walk down the street. Oh, that guy's an asshole. Right. That guy looks like he might be okay. When you analyze this, from a Darwinian point of view, what you're actually doing is, in a way, sizing up those cues that are relevant to assessing them in terms of your own kind of Darwinian interests, right?
Yeah.
It's like you see very old man hobbling along who could not possibly compete with you for a woman, and you don't go, oh, he's an asshole, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, if you look at the guys, John, and I'm talking to you, buddy, mm-hmm. If you look at the guys that you kind of size up, in that way, I submit that they are people who are in a position to compete with you, if not for mates per se, then for kind of social status.
Yeah. I think you're more into that alpha male, beta male thing than I am, Bob.
Well, of course, once you become an alpha male, John, and you'll have to take my word for this. It's really important to
Bob,
say that.
That's such an alpha male thing to say.
No, but see, here's what I submit is that, actually, I think you're a relatively good person in this way. I don't think you're.
Oh, shucks.
No, I think you are, but I also think that the fact that you're saying you're not especially susceptible to this doesn't mean it's true, because I think in general, this is the whole point. This is why we call it enlightenment. These things generally reside at the unconscious level. Okay?
Yeah.
So, and I've heard you, John. I've heard you go on about people in your... I've heard you diss people in your profession.
Oh, absolutely.
And none of them were old, crippled men, okay?
Well,
in fact, I don't think any of them were women, come to think of it. This is interesting.
I like to think that I certainly take a great deal of pleasure professionally taking down really big inflated egos. I'm not sure what that's about.
I have a theory, but go ahead.
Well, let me ask you this. So I guess the question for me is, and I think one of the difficulties for me with all these questions is that even though I wrote a whole book about just to try to get it out of my system, is that I'm still unsettled. I'm still unresolved. I like to come to a position of certainty, like with superstrings, where I know it's a bunch of crap. I'm still haunted by the possibility that there's something in Buddhism and meditation that would be useful for me. But the question I have about trying to reach this kind of knowledge that gives you a perspective that actually makes you a kind of healthier person is whether reason isn't enough. So your study of evolutionary psychology gave you insight into yourself and to others and help you realize the ways that we deceive ourselves constantly, and as you said, that the kind of restricted way that we see ourselves relative to others. But why wasn't that enough? Why did that? You said that didn't necessarily make you happy. So you've turned to Buddhism and meditation for something else. Is that an extension of reason, or is it something entirely different?
Well, first of all, I hope we get around to letting me answer your question about why you have this this desire to puncture big egos and so on, because it's not irrelevant to what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. I have a Darwinian explanation for your entire intellectual life, John. But you may not want to confront it in public, so maybe we should save it for later.
No, Jesus Christ, no! I've got it. Hey, listen, I'm always willing to let others take me on the next step toward my own personal enlightenment. But can I just tell you that the justification I give myself for attacking certain people is that they are responsible for bad ideas, and I think that it's important for an intellectual not only to try to put out his or her own personal ideology, but to try to sort of clear the ground and get rid of all the bullshit. And that's what I've tried to do in my writings. It's sort of the skeptical path for me. On the other hand, then you come to the end of it, and there you are. You're a lonely skeptic, and you're still looking for something, for some kind of personal truth that you can believe in.
Well, it's classically human for you to have come up for this high-minded moral rationale for this thing you do that has happened to coincide with maximizing your social status. But no, I mean, but I won't go any deeper than that right now. We'll do it off camera, and I'll probably charge you for it by the hour.
Wait a minute, I just have to say, maximizing my social status, I'm considered an asshole by most scientists who
right, but you don't hang out with them. You're not looking for their esteem. You're not looking for their esteem. You've chosen this pool in which you can garner high esteem. You know, we all have people who diss us. None of us can be popular among everyone. But that's, Well,
at least you've got an in-group to belong to. I don't really have an in-group.
I don't want to get self-absorbed here because it would be so unlike me. But this last book I wrote has no constituency.
Yeah.
Anyway,
funny how that worked out.
What was the question you asked?
Reason. The limits of reason for.
Well, that should be obvious. Well, let's just take a simple case. It's not especially about my motivation for any of this, but you eat too much sugar, and somebody comes along and tells you, well, the evolutionary psychology explanation for this is that back in the savannah, you couldn't get too much sugar because there wasn't refined sugar, fruit was rare, whatever. So you would eat all you could whenever you got it, and it wasn't bad for you. Now we're in this environment where there's plenty, and you're prone to eat too much. Does that really do you any good, John? To know that? Doesn't do me any good. By itself, that doesn't help me resist the next candy bar.
Yeah, I guess not.
And in general, with evolutionary psychology, just knowing about the source of the temptations doesn't help me. And knowing and being, I think, more conscious than the average person of the way my Darwinianly shaped mind distorts my appraisal of people and ideas, it helps in the sense that I am more aware of it, but it doesn't by itself make it less likely to happen, and it absolutely doesn't make me more at ease in any sense.
Well, actually, this is a really important point. I just want to note that the assumption of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis in general is that self-knowledge leads to some kind of psychic relief, and that even reliving traumatic experiences in the case of classic Freudian analysis leads to some kind of catharsis. And I think that the issue you just raised has to do with the therapeutic, at least the traditional therapeutic model in general. The link between insight and happiness is very tenuous, if it exists at all.
Knowledge by itself won't do it. So the idea of Buddhism, at least meditational Buddhism, which incidentally is not what Buddhism is for most people in Asia, but it is, you have to have a practice, okay? The knowledge is not enough.
Right.
You have to have a practice, and you have to assimilate the knowledge during the practice, and the practice is going to have to, I think in concrete terms, be triggering some sort of biochemical stuff that helps you assimilate the knowledge in a way that's ultimately more productive.
Why not just take
That's the premise, and I think it's true.
Why not just take Prozac?
Well, look, I think someday maybe there won't be meditation because we're so good at intervening in the at the biochemical level without it. But
mystical technologies. That's something I wanted to talk about. Whether or not we can, I
will say, I don't think Prozac is probably a good substitute for it, judging by my observations of I think Prozac has its uses, but I don't think it leads you into this kind of Buddhist state of mind. It may alleviate your suffering, but not with the same kind of moral tenor that the Buddhism might give you.
So I want to go back to the question of enlightenment for a second. First of all, I have, as you have, met a bunch of people who claim to be enlightened. So one is Ken Wilber, who's this kind of mystical intellectual who's written zillions of books trying to fuse Western psychology and philosophy with Eastern mysticism. I also interviewed Andrew Cohen, who's this cult leader who has basically said that he's as enlightened as Buddha. I met this really interesting guy about 10 years ago.
I doubt he'd describe himself as a cult leader, but anyway.
No, but he has said that he's as enlightened as a person can be.
Has he? Has Ken Wilber said that?
Oh, Ken Wilber said that he had reached the state of non-dual awareness, which is the highest state of mystical oneness.
See, I don't think that's crazy. I don't think I'll ever get there, but I can see... I see where he's heading.
Well, the interesting thing to me about these people is that they've attained this state that has fascinated me ever since I learned about it when I was a teenager. So of course, I'm really curious to see what they're like in person. And what's funny about Ken Wilber is that he's just another fucked up, neurotic, arrogant, insecure intellectual, just like you and me, Bob. He's...
Hey.
He just happens to have
Speak
this...
for yourself, buddy.
He just happens...
I don't use profanity in describing my own situation, thank you.
He just happens to have this weird... It's almost like he's lifted weights and he's got biceps the size of cannonballs, and you look at it and wow, you're really impressed, but is he qualitatively different than you and me? No, not really.
No, in fact, is it okay if I show them my biceps now, John, on camera?
Well, so
one of many things I have in common with Ken Wilber.
Well,
people can turn to your book, Rational Mysticism, for the full unfair takedown of Ken Wilber.
Right,
But,
who I call the weightlifting bodhisattva. So to me, I've profiled a lot of scientists who are brilliant and won Nobel Prizes and so forth, and I try to convey a sense of their personalities, and sometimes that's relevant and sometimes it's not. But the personality is absolutely relevant when you're talking about somebody who's supposedly attained a degree of mystical insight, because that insight is supposed to affect your personality in profound ways. And I'm meeting these people, and I just don't see it. I have met people who I think are wise and have a sense of compassion and gentleness that is extraordinary. It does make them different from people like you and me, but as far as I can tell, that's not related necessarily to any kind of spiritual practice. So that's one reason for the skepticism that I have about the whole spiritual path. And as I'm sure you know, so many of the gurus that emerged in the 1960s and 1970s turned out to be really sociopathic. They became, from the outside looking in, they became intoxicated by this power that they wielded over their devotees.
Yeah, now look, you give people power and a big following, and most of them will succumb to the obvious temptations. I don't think that has much to do with the validity of, mystical inquiry or something.
You don't think it? I mean, how can it not? These are the people who hold themselves up as exemplars of mystical insight, and some of them are
the
not.
People you choose to write about. You could have gone where I went to this meditation retreat. You could have gone and interviewed the people who teach there, and you just wouldn't have found that they're like narcissistic weightlifters, and that would have been bad for you, so you chose not to talk to people like that.
No, that's not true.
Then you couldn't have written this book where everyone's an asshole.
No, that's not true. I have nice things to say even about Ken Wilber, but in my book...
Well, right, but I mean, you choose people you can caricature.
No, that's not true at all. I had a whole chapter on Susan Blackmore, who is a fascinating person. She's a kind of evolutionary psychologist, Zen mystic.
She wrote a book about memes.
And I feel very sympathetic toward her outlook. I portrayed her in a very positive light.
Well,
there's also a guy named Ken Wilber, James Austin, who wrote a book called Zen in the Brain that I highly recommend. It's one of the best attempts to approach Buddhism from a scientific perspective. He was one of these people that struck me as being wise and at ease in a way that I envied a lot. And I think
was he a practicing Buddhist?
Oh yeah, he.
Well, then why are you saying that? The problem with Buddhism is that it may be that all the gurus are a good proportion. That's the problem. I mean, of course, look. The thing about a guru is, right, they're holding themselves up as some kind of paragon. Well, look, I can tell you that in general, across the realm, beyond Buddhism, anyone who does that is probably, is just suspect. I just don't think, well, we disagree about how relevant it is that you can point to gurus who abuse their power.
Well,
or even that most of them do. Most of the people who claim to be gurus.
Well, I guess I wanted to. I didn't want to stop just by saying I haven't totally dismissed Buddhism just because they're gurus who are sociopaths. I do see some Buddhists who have achieved something that looks pretty good to me, and then the question is what is it? What is it that they've achieved? So there's a Buddhist named Stephen Batchelor, and I wrote a piece on the web. I'll link to it on this chat, and he's written a couple of books about Buddhism where he strips it down to its essentials. I think one of his books is called Buddhism Without Beliefs, And so he takes all the metaphysics and reincarnation and karma and all that stuff, and he talks about his personal experiences, what he's achieved through meditation, although his most profound experience came spontaneously. He wasn't meditating. And for him, enlightenment means this. It's not an answer. It's seeing the mystery of existence. It's seeing the question in all its glory. And you realize that no answers are adequate to that. So it's the state.
Well, that's of course very compatible with your shtick, which is that everyone who purports to have an answer is full of shit. I mean, that's your whole. That's what you write about.
That's right.
And so you would naturally like that. And I don't deny that there's, you look around and go, whoa, there's a lot of mystery. That's true. Why it has this special emotional impact on him and you is kind of a personal question.
Yeah.
And why you're saying. That's enlightenment. So nothing else can be is to follow a train of logic I don't understand.
Yeah.
But to me, I don't know where that would get me. I agree the universe is mysterious. I don't know why why you would say that's the answer or why it's an especially useful answer. I don't understand. So anyway, the practice I'm interested in goes beyond that and does other things.
It's not a particularly useful answer, although the state
and it's not exclusive of other questions or answers.
No, it's not. And one of the people that I interviewed for Rational Mysticism, I didn't include him in the book, but he was a really interesting guy. His name is Robert Foreman, and I think you've come across his work yourself. He wrote a book called, I think it's The Problem of Pure Consciousness, and he also claimed to have reached the highest level of enlightenment through transcendental meditation. And what I found interesting about him was that he said that there was no awe or wonder. I'm saying that I think awe and wonder are the essence of enlightenment. And he said that had nothing to do with has nothing to do with his experience. For him, it was this sense of unity and sort of consciousness as being. He actually drew me a little diagram to try to explain what he experiences in this state of sort of an eyeball in a circuit that ends up looking at itself, an eyeball looking at an eyeball, and you reach this state of consciousness where you understand something really profound about the nature of consciousness.
Yeah, well, that's one path, and I think if I pursued meditation more and more deeply and went to a lot of extended retreats, I might wind up making claims along those lines. But I will say, the things I've been kind of looking into are, in a sense, more mundane. They're about consciousness. They're about, in a way, but it's more, it's a little more self-helpy, and yet also, I think, related to actual enlightenment, related to the actual truth. And, we again get to the fact that there's all different kinds of Buddhism.
Yeah.
And the kind I've been looking at is Vipassana, and not only that, but an Americanized version of Vipassana. And a big emphasis there is, what it has in common with Zen is you start kind of, you focus on your breath. And I think another thing it has in common with Zen is, a difference is that you close your eyes in Vipassana meditation, not in Zen. I think you'll hear also in Zen the idea that to the extent that your mind strays from your breath, try to pay attention to what is making your mind stray. Mm-hmm. Feelings of yours that distract you, etc. And the ultimate goal through much practice is to become so aware of the forces of these distracting things and these things that have an emotional pull on you that you cease to be their slave. Mm-hmm. Okay? And so that's a very practical thing, but that can be useful if it works, because I think I personally feel totally a slave to my impulses, not just in the sense of kind of base impulses at all, but even in the sense of just, you're trying to focus on your work, and you see a headline in your browser that distracts you, and if you pay attention, it's when things distract you, it's because they have a little bit of an emotional tug. There's part of your your emotions that they're tugging at. you know, I mean,
Sure.
writers of tabloid headlines have this down to a science, right? They know how to get your attention by appealing to, you know, resentment, lust, suspicion of certain kinds of people, whatever. So, you know, a lot of the practice I've been pursuing is just about trying to be less enslaved by these impulses. Now, you know, in my mind, there's a connection here with the Darwinism, because when you look at the things that have this pull on you, it's totally consistent with what you'd expect based on a Darwinian view of human nature. But I'm just saying that you're kind of describing, I mean, you know, you went off and talked to the people who were making the grandest claims about enlightenment, and it was ultimate metaphysical enlightenment, an ultimate understanding of consciousness, and I'm like, congratulations, it's just that my aspirations are in a slightly different realm.
Well, I do believe, the enlightenment that I believe in is still pretty grand. Let me try to give you, so I'm talking about awe and wonder.
But I thought it was that you didn't believe in it.
I don't believe in it as something that makes you a significantly different person than the rest of us who are mucking around in the problems of life. It's not an escape clause in reality. And I think one of the problems...
Well, I will say, just as punctuation, I'm sorry, but those Buddhist monks who immolated themselves to protest the Vietnam War and did not flinch as they went up into flames, they had achieved a state that you and I have not achieved. I'm sorry.
Oh, certainly. But I see that as a... I mean, obviously, if you spend all your time meditating and practicing these mind control techniques, you will develop, in the same way that an athlete will develop certain physical attributes, those monks will develop extraordinary cognitive attributes. The question I have is, does that make you give you almost supernatural powers? Is it something that the rest of us should really devote our lives to?
Well, not necessarily, but that's a separate question. I mean, I think you were just saying that you don't even believe these people are really different from us, right? Leave aside whether you should try to do it. I think you just said these people aren't really different from us, right?
They're not different in the way that gurus often claim. And they don't achieve this kind of moral grace. They don't achieve any kind of extraordinary insight into reality that the rest of us don't have.
I think it's true that the people who go around saying, I'm a guru, and generating these big followings don't have moral grace. But that's for an obvious reason, right? They are not representative of Buddhists who have practiced seriously. They are an aberration. They are the entrepreneurs, you know?
I think some of them... let me try to explain why I think some gurus go bad. The experience that...
Who cares? But go ahead.
Well, the experience that I've had... No, because I think it has something to do with genuine mystical insight. The experience I've had... So one of the people that I described in Rational Mysticism was an astronaut named Edgar Mitchell, who was part of the Apollo program. In 1971, he went up into space, and he's looking out of the spacecraft, and he sees the Earth floating in this gigantic black void, and he had a mystical experience. And basically it was seeing life, in this case the Earth, this emblem of life, against nothingness, against infinity. Right. And his mind was blown, and he came back and founded the Noetic Sciences Institute to try to promote research on parapsychology, of all things. So that's what happens. People get these mystical insights, and then they come up with these crazy ideologies to try to make sense of them. But to me, what was the experiences that I've had were very similar to that. It was basically seeing all this kind of humdrum reality sort of suddenly the walls fall away, and you see infinity right behind it, and you are overwhelmed by the improbability of it all. This is what I liked about Stephen Batchelor. You see the question, you see the mystery, except it's not like, oh wow, life is weird. It's absolutely mind-blowing. And I think that can lead you in two directions as a mystic. One is you see life as infinitely precious because it is so improbable. It came through who knows what. Why did it emerge in the first place? It could be extinguished at any second as well. Therefore, cherish every moment that you have. Cherish every other living thing that's here. The flip side of that is that life is just this little spark in the void. It could be extinguished at any moment. Nothing matters. Pain, human suffering, what does it matter? It's here today, gone tomorrow. That can turn you into a sociopath or a nihilist who doesn't give a shit about anything. And I think some of these sociopathic gurus, their behavior comes directly from that insight of the human condition against the backdrop of infinity, which leads them to not give a damn about anybody else.
I actually have a more mundane explanation for what happens is that they realize that the more they claim to be gurus, the more they get laid. But I think
those aren't inconsistent. Those aren't inconsistent explanations.
Well,
they're
no,
perfectly
they
compatible
they
with
may
each other.
in rationalizing that draw somewhat on. It's just so easy to rationalize anything you want to rationalize. You can rationalize it as a Christian. You can rationalize anything as anything. But I think there's something. I mean, I want to say two things. First of all, I really increasingly don't think you've taken a serious look at Buddhist philosophy. I mean, you keep what you do is.
That's what Robert Thurman told me.
Well, it's well. Don't get me started talking about him. But I think it's true because all I hear you saying is the kinds of there's this particular kind of mystical experience that has to do with awe and mystery that you think is valid, and it feeds in some ways plays directly into your whole kind of vocational identity, and fine. And I'm not saying it's invalid, but then rather than but that leaves out like 98% of what Buddhist philosophy is actually about, and the way you handle the other 98% is to say, I met 3 gurus who were assholes, so I'm not going to talk about it. Their whole underlying philosophy must be bullshit.
No, that's
well, then grapple with it, John.
That's a gross exaggeration.
What's wrong with it?
I just told you that I also have interviewed Buddhists for whom I have enormous respect. I still think that I have something to gain from Buddhism. I have a profound aversion to systems, to organized religions or any kind of intellectual
and grand scientific theories and everything else.
Ideology. So Joseph Campbell has this wonderful metaphor of religious practice as like a boat that you use to cross from one shore of experience to another shore of experience. And he said that most people, when they get to the other shore, they instead of leaving the boat behind, which is the sensible thing to do, they drag the boat along with them. That's the equivalent of people who drag along the ideology of Christianity or Buddhism. One of the best Buddhist sayings, one of my favorite Buddhist sayings is, if you meet the Buddha in the road, kill him. What I like best about Buddhism is that powerful, self-critical feature of it, where you're questioning everything, including all the precepts of Buddhism itself. But Buddhism, like every other religion, tends to ossify over time. And Buddhists, as you probably know, since you've written about Buddhism, intellectual Western Buddhists are the most smug, self-righteous people in the world. Whatever you say about Buddhism, they're going to find fault with it and tell you that you haven't understood the fine points of this or that doctrine. That, to me, just demonstrates how screwed up this ideology and all spiritual ideologies are, that you have to leave them behind. I'm not saying that I've found any answers by leaving them behind. I'm still trapped in my own skepticism. I realize that. But I don't know. If I will say that if there was any religion that I had to pick, if I was forced to pick, it would be Buddhism.
Yeah, well, I think there's some question as to whether the kind of Buddhism we're mainly talking about even is a religion. I mean, I'm not. I'm not. It's more of a secular philosophy of life and practice that I'm thinking about, because I'm not talking about reincarnation or karma as an actual force with force kind of. I mean, but
the Santa Claus doctrine.
What?
The Santa Claus doctrine. Karma is. So I wrote this piece for Slate, and this is one of the. This is where I got a lot of these angry notes from Buddhists telling me that I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. But I pointed out that I grew up as a Catholic, and Catholicism, like all Christianity, has this doctrine of a God who is judging all our actions and will mete out his judgment at the end of time. And the Buddhists like to say, well, they have no God, but there's an implicit God-like figure, just like Santa Claus, watching whether we're naughty or nice, within Buddhism and the mechanism of karma, which is adding up our good acts and our bad acts, and then making a calculation that determines whether we're reincarnated as the Dalai Lama or a cockroach.
I mean, you're right. I mean, the difference is it's a little easier to imagine the kind of karma governor as a mere computer, in a way, without a personality. But I basically agree with you. I mean, I also agree with you that there is, and this has been much discussed, in Buddhist philosophy, the danger of veering over into nihilism. I would not so much I would not put it in the context you put it in, because you got that out of this particular kind of mystical experience that you're very attracted to. But I would say that I would get there differently. I mean, let me say, I don't think we've talked much about. Well, let me say something about those Buddhist monks in Vietnam who immolated themselves. I mean, you were saying, well, sure, you can come up with tremendous power to control the mind. I suspect, though, that that's not all we're seeing on display there.
Right.
I mean, first of all, you have to admit there's a certain amount of self-sacrifice there, right? When you set yourself on fire to try to bring a war to an end.
Okay.
Now, and I would say that whatever you think of it, that follows from a different part of Buddhism than mind control. It's the philosophical part that tries to, well, in extreme form, says the self does not even exist in the first place. In any event, tries to drive home that yourself is not special. Right. And in that sense, I think that's like truth. I mean, that is the truth. We are all designed for obvious reasons consistent with the theory of natural selection, to go about tending our own bodily needs and the needs of loved ones and so on, and that involves a certain amount of actual kind of illusion, right? There's a certain kind of solipsism we're all involved in, thinking that we're the center of the universe, we matter more. I mean, when you even try to hail a cab and get more attention than the other person trying to hail a cab, in a way you're saying it's more important that I get this cab than that person. I mean, we all go through life asserting our specialness in ways we don't really think about, and part of Buddhist philosophy is a very serious enterprise, is to try to move us away from that a little. Now,
but I just have to say, self-immolation is repugnant to me. So if you're holding up
fine,
these...
but John, I'm saying, look, I'm not planning to immolate myself, and maybe.
Boost your book sales.
What they did, I'll tell you honestly, if someone kills themselves to save many, many others, that's not repugnant to me. That's more morally enlightened than I will ever be.
Did those people accomplish that? I think.
Well, they may have failed. But for purposes of I don't know. But for purposes of the thought experiment, if you can kill yourself and save 100 people, to me, that is to behave in a more morally enlightened way than I will probably ever behave. And I'm saying that, look, Buddhism has this whole philosophical apparatus that is trying to move people away from their self-centeredness, and that's one of just a number of dimensions of the philosophy. And the way you address that, so far as I can tell, is to go find some guru who's had sex with 500 followers and say, it must all be bullshit.
Bob, you keep saying that, and I keep telling you that
that's because you never address the actual substance of Buddhism.
Here, let me tell you.
Do it. What's wrong with what I just just said.
I'll tell you. I'll start with your self-immolating monks. That to me is an example of this kind of anti-life or contempt for life and mortality that lies at the heart of Buddhism. So one of the things that I've said about Buddhism that most enrages Buddhists is to point out that Buddha's quest for enlightenment began when he left his wife and children. And then he became a solitary monk. And it seems to me, and then he before that he had realized that life is all about suffering. He'd been this prince, and he'd seen a sick person and a dead person outside of the walls of his compound, and this is the first time that he realized that the depths of suffering in life and how we're all facing death ultimately. So what do you do about that? And the solution that he came up with, I believe, was to attain some kind of distance or disinterest in life, in mortal things, including your own self, that immunizes you against heartbreak. I see it really as a system for making us not fall in love with things that are ephemeral. And heartbreak is a horrible thing. It's the deepest pain that we can experience in many respects in life. I've certainly experienced enough of it in my life to know that it's something I would prefer not to have. On the other hand, it comes from our greatest attribute as creatures, which is our ability to love others. So that, and I think your self-immolating monks show what happens when you have this kind of ideology. They're showing it's weird, it's paradoxical, because they're expressing concern for the people who are being killed in Vietnam by destroying themselves, but I think it's a very, very screwed up philosophy. What I feel I personally need is not to become less interested or somehow disconnected from the things that can potentially cause me heartache, but to just learn how to deal with heartache more. You described in your own experience on that Zen retreat what obviously seemed to be...
I've never been on a Zen retreat. They were both Vipassana.
Buddhist retreat. What sounded to me like a classic unitive experience. You were talking about, you felt this connection with a weed, for Christ's sake. You were looking around at the other people on your retreat, and instead of judging them as you usually do, you were seeing them with great sympathy. I assume that part of that was that we're all basically the same. We're all trying to get through this difficult life, harming each other as little as possible. That's the positive side of...
But what was the negative side that was part of my frame of mind at that moment? I mean, you tell me, at the end of the retreat, you're characterizing my beliefs accurately, although I didn't really bond with a weed so much. That's a little misleading. I kind of bonded with a lizard, but that's different. Anyway, so yeah, you're right. I'm feeling more sympathy and empathy toward these people around me, okay?
Right.
I go home, I call my wife, and she says, I like this Bob more, just from talking to me 5 minutes, okay? So it's not coming at any cost in terms of my behavior toward my loved ones. So now you tell me, what's wrong with the frame of mind I was in at that point?
I think that part of Buddhism is that sense of unity with other things is fine. It's just that is elevated to a kind of metaphysical principle that we are one with all things. Therefore, there's an implicit denigration of particular love, of falling in love with this particular person. So Buddha leaves his wife and children and then seeks this kind of metaphysical love with all things, but it comes with a recognition that all things pass, that nothing is permanent. And that, I think, leads to a contempt to life. You see that in the way that Buddhism elevates celibate male monkhood as the epitome of spirituality, which I think is also a very screwed up set of values.
Well, that's also true of Christianity, parts of it.
Absolutely.
And I think, again, what you're doing is you're taking these people who are manifestly not typical of people who do meditative practice, and saying, this is the problem, you'll become like them. Well, no, there's overwhelming evidence that almost nobody becomes like them, But so, and I'm telling you, so let's get back to normal people like me, and I'm still waiting for you to tell me. I mean, what you had said was, yeah, Buddhism does this, but there's this downside. Okay, back to the state of mind I was in at the end of this retreat, where my family is saying I'm better and more loving than ever.
Yeah.
I have more sympathy and empathy for people I'm not related to. What was the downside?
Why does that necessarily have anything to do with Buddhism?
I had just been on a 1-week meditation retreat imbibing Buddhist philosophy and engaging in Buddhist practice. That's clearly is the independent variable.
Did the Buddhist teachings, did all the ideological claptrap have anything to do with the experience that you had that led you to feel oneness with the lizard?
Well, yes, but in a certain sense, I had already absorbed the teachings. As I told you, I already thought I kind of got the picture. But yes, the substance of the teachings is part of the thing. But as I also said, the teachings aren't enough. You need a practice to operationalize them.
Hey, Bob.
But you're dodging the... I mean, you're saying that whatever's good in Buddhism comes at the cost of something that's bad. What was bad?
I'm saying,
you tell me.
I guess my attitude toward all religions and spiritual paths is that they're all encrusted with all this metaphysical, ritualistic baggage. So look in there for something that you can find that's useful. I agree that sometimes the way I write about these things, I am throwing the baby out with the bathwater. All I can tell you is that I'm still looking for things that I can extract from these that might be useful. You found something that's useful for you, obviously. I mean, you've got empirical proof of it, or that your wife Lisa can testify you. Power to you. That's great. But why even? That to me, that's a practice that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with Buddhism. I asked Stephen Batchelor, this is the Buddhism Without Beliefs guy, why he even called himself a Buddhist anymore, because he had sort of stripped away all the usual components of Buddhism to the point where he just had this philosophy of doubt and questioning. And he said, really it just came from feeling grateful toward Buddhism for having set him out on his path. But at this point he was just really an ordinary agnostic. And it seems to me that given...
Oh, well, wait, I'm not talking about some kind of theistic Buddhism here.
Yeah, okay.
I'm talking about secular Buddhism from the get-go. I'm not talking about... I said that.
Yeah. Hey, Bob, I just have to... Before this talk ended, I wanted to tell you that I do have a spiritual practice that I engage in every now and then. It's a form of meditation, and I have my own personal mantra, and I'm going to practice it right now.
Yes, I know. I read your Bachelor piece, so I know the punchline, but go ahead.
Duh.
Right. That expresses your sense of wondrous befuddlement at the workings of the universe or something.
That's it.
That was duh, right?
Duh. D-U-H.
Duh, right.
And the thing is,
right.
Bob, as a result of my own entheogenic experiences, I know that God himself, the highest form of intelligence that can exist in this universe, is
John Horgan.
Is just as befuddled as we are. Yes, of course, God is. I am God, and so are you, God, Bob.
Well, we've gone an hour, so I guess we have to go. You successfully kept me from conveying to you the definitive John Horgan critique, explaining to you why you feel this compulsion to debunk all grand claims and systems and philosophies and so on. So you dodged a bullet this time. And next time, if we ever resume this conversation, I will ask you if, as I think the implication of what you said about those Buddhist monks is, that if we have a thought experiment where I can save 100 people and kill myself, or choose to live and 100 die, then you think the better thing to do is let the 100 die. I think that's the implication.
That, to me, that kind of calculation is awfully close to the one that leads to suicide bombing. So I think we need to create a world where people aren't forced to make those kinds of choices.
Well, yeah, I mean, it could lead to suicide bombing in the same context in which, if you weren't a Buddhist, it would just lead to bombing. So, I mean,
right.
It's like, I don't think it's the core of the problem. But,
Bob,
I'm not sure we got to the bottom of things, John.
Bob,
and I'm not sure there will be a clamoring for us to return and
Bob, I
try
think
again, but
I think
it was fun.
You are a better person since I have no idea. Correlation isn't causation, but I think you were just nicer since you got into Buddhism. So
That's a joke, right?
No, it's not.
It's not?
No, I mean it.
When was I so bad?
Oh, God. You used to be, as a writer and as a person, you just used to be much more critical and nasty about other people.
Well, that's just age. That's just declining testosterone
that's
level.
it.
You see that in every writer's history.
I think that's true. I'm becoming nicer as a writer, too. I want to say positive things about people now.
Yeah, well, I think I may be ahead of you along this particular dimension.
Always ahead of me, Bob.
There's time, but I think so long as I remain an inspiration to you, there's hope for you.
Okay. I'll let you end on that note, Bob.
Thank you. That's a graciousness you would not have exhibited as a younger man, John.
Just try it tomorrow.
Duh. I don't do a mantra, but I'll try it tomorrow.
Okay.
Yes. All right.
All right.
Thanks.
I enjoyed it.
See you next time.
Bye.